Thank you, and thank you, Kate. So my novel Questions of Travel is a very hefty 500-page hardback book, i.e. completely unsuited to travel. And I didn't bring an iPad with me, so I'm reading from a grubby photocopy. The title, as you will no doubt recognise, is stolen, of course, from Elizabeth Bishop's magnificent poem, Questions of Travel. And there's been a lot of talk in recent days about short versus long form and poetry versus fiction. And I think the clear superiority of poetry over the novel is illustrated by my example, where Elizabeth Bishop says magnificently in a little over a page what it takes me 500 pages to approximate. And she didn't even write all the way to the right-hand margin. Questions of Travel is structured as a double narrative. One strand follows the adventures of an Australian woman called Laura, and the other follows a Sri Lankan man called Ravi. It covers about 40 years in time, and I'm going to read from fairly early on in the book, from the mid-1980s, where Laura is a young woman in her early 20s, and she's left Australia for the first time and is backpacking through Bali. There's a mention of someone called Corinne, who is a French-Canadian backpacker who has befriended Laura. So this is Laura in Bali. Her guidebook had guided. Stay in family-run lodgements. Your money goes directly to locals, not to the multinationals who own the big hotels. So Laura stayed with Balinese families and talked to their children in useful vocabulary. Corinne, who had studied anthropology, spoke of the benefits of cross-cultural encounters. In the measure one learns from the Balinese people, our Western egotism erodes. Have you remarked their faces? So full of joy. Then she asked how much Laura was paying for her room. Laura named the sum, a few Australian dollars. Corinne was dismayed, but it is bourgeois to pay what they ask. That I can tell you without error. To respect their culture, you must not give more than half. On Laura's last evening on the island, Wayan, the owner of the lodgement, inserted a tape of gamelan music into a cassette recorder and placed lanterns around the yard. His barefoot daughters began dancing, costumed in sarongs tucked up under their arms. Nimble as fish, their hands darted and curved. The smallest child, wearied of the performance, broke off mid-step and went away. She reappeared from the shadows later to pick up the dance. On a woven mat beside Laura and Corinne, the children's grandmother had nodded off. When the tape came to an end, only the two visitors applauded. The next morning, when the last strap on her backpack was fastened, Laura looked around her room. Quite soon, it would be swept clean. Someone else, pillowed on fresh linen, would dream in her bed. The clouds would still press on the hilltops. The children's voices would sound like rain. But the quilted green view would keep no trace of her gaze. The life of the place would flow on as if it had never known Laura Fraser. She dismissed the thought. It was plainly nonsense. When she had settled her bill, Laura followed Bayan into the family's living quarters for farewells. A patch of colour sang in the dimness there. It was a cardboard box, decorated with purple and yellow tulips, that had once held Kleenex. Laura had thrown it away the previous day. Now it displayed its pretty pattern on a shelf. Laura made a to-do of getting out her notebook and speaking to the children. In a flurry of shame, she wrote down their names and the family's address. Corinne appeared, yawning in a white cotton nightie. She had already explained that she wouldn't be staying in touch. To travel is to say goodbye. The rest of the day, vexatious with fumes and delays, barely registered with Laura. She was lightheaded with schemes. She would write to every guidebook and tourist office recommending the Losman. She would pay for the education of the youngest girl. She would send the family something marvelous and transforming, a new motorbike or an electric jug. She had taken photos of everyone. She would post them copies for a start. But in India, Laura's canisters of film disappeared from her pack while it was strapped to the roof of a bus. Months later, in London, the Losman children rose from an address in her notebook. It wasn't too late. She could still buy them little gifts. While hesitating over what to buy, she decided to enclose a letter explaining the absence of photos, describing her adventures. So much had receded that had loomed large when she was staying with the family. The old lady's cataracts, Wyon's plans for expanding the business, the children's progress at school. The letter would inquire about all these things. She embarked on it at once and covered 3 pages with barely a pause. Then came a knock at her door, or some other interruption. Laura had every intention of finishing the letter, buying the presents, posting the package. But she never did.